The crack of the leather whip echoed through the marble ballroom, silencing the string quartet in an instant. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead while hundreds of elite guests stood frozen, champagne glasses suspended in trembling hands. The grand engagement celebration of the city's most feared Mafia dynasty had transformed into something horrifying. At the center of the polished floor knelt a young plus-size maid named Isabella. Her black uniform was torn across one shoulder. A silver serving tray had rolled several feet away, shattered crystal scattered around it like frozen tears. Blood slowly stained the white sleeve she desperately tried to hide behind her back. Standing above her was Vanessa Romano. Beautiful, elegant, and utterly merciless. As the future queen of the Romano crime empire, Vanessa smiled with chilling satisfaction while another whip coiled around her wrist. She wasn't punishing a servant. She was making an example. "No one embarrasses me in front of my guests," she announced coldly. Another lash sliced through the air. Isabella didn't scream. She bit her lip until blood filled her mouth. The silence that followed felt even louder than the strike itself. The guests exchanged nervous glances, but nobody dared interfere. Everyone feared the same man. The man whose engagement they had gathered to celebrate. The ruthless mafia boss who ruled half the city's underworld without raising his voice. Lorenzo Romano. He wasn't supposed to arrive for another hour. Vanessa knew that. Which was why she enjoyed every second. She slowly circled the kneeling maid. "Look at her," she laughed. A clumsy, oversized servant pretending she belongs among elegant people. Several wealthy socialites forced uncomfortable smiles. Others looked away. No one defended Isabella. No one noticed the old silver necklace hidden beneath her uniform, a necklace she never removed, no matter how poor she became. Vanessa raised the whip again. "This will teach every servant what happens when they ruin my evening." The leather descended. But it never landed. A large hand caught it in midair. The ballroom temperature seemed to drop instantly. Nobody had heard the doors open. Nobody had noticed the bodyguards entering. They simply realized one terrifying fact at exactly the same moment. Lorenzo Romano was standing there. His tailored black suit looked untouched by the rain outside. His expression revealed nothing. His cold gray eyes slowly moved from Vanessa's hand, to the blood on Isabella's sleeve, to the terrified maid still kneeling on the floor. No one breathed. Vanessa's smile disappeared. "My love," she whispered, trying to recover. Lorenzo released the whip. It fell onto the marble with a loud crack. He didn't even look at his fiancée. Instead, he removed his expensive jacket. Without saying a single word, he draped it across Isabella's trembling shoulders. The gesture shocked everyone more than violence ever could. A mafia king did not cover servants with his own coat. He barely acknowledged ordinary people existed. Yet here he was kneeling before an injured maid while hundreds of guests watched in disbelief. Isabella lowered her eyes. She expected punishment. Instead, Lorenzo noticed something glimmering beneath the torn fabric of her uniform. The silver necklace. His heartbeat stopped. He had seen that necklace once before. Years ago. On a frightened teenage girl who had hidden him inside an abandoned church while rival families hunted him through the streets. She had shared her last piece of bread with a wounded stranger without ever learning his real name. Before dawn she had vanished, leaving behind only one unforgettable promise. "If you survive," she had whispered, "become someone who protects people, not someone everyone fears." He had searched for her for nearly 10 years. Every investigator, every private detective, every informant. Nothing. Until now. Covered in blood. Forced onto her knees. Working as a servant inside his own mansion. A place where she should have been safest. Vanessa stepped closer, unaware of the storm forming inside him. "She's just a maid," she said quickly. "She embarrassed our family." Lorenzo finally looked at his fiancée. His face remained unreadable. That terrified everyone more. Because the underworld had a saying. When Lorenzo shouted, someone lost money. When Lorenzo smiled, someone lost power. But when he became completely silent, people disappeared. Across the ballroom, dozens of mafia captains slowly lowered their eyes. Even they sensed something irreversible had just happened. Lorenzo carefully helped Isabella to her feet. She nearly collapsed. He caught her before she hit the floor. She whispered only 2 words. "I'm sorry." He stared at her in disbelief. Even after everything. She apologized. The same girl who had once saved his life now believed she deserved punishment. Something inside the cold-hearted crime king shattered. Without warning, he turned toward the guests. Then toward his fiancée. And finally toward the head of household security. His next command would determine the fate of everyone inside the mansion. But no one could predict whether he intended to punish the maid. Or destroy his own empire to protect her. Rising action. Lorenzo ordered the orchestra to stop playing. The music died. Every heartbeat inside the ballroom became audible. He instructed his personal physician to treat Isabella immediately, not in the servants' quarters but inside the private family medical suite reserved only for the Romano bloodline. The announcement spread through the guests like wildfire. Vanessa stood frozen. She had expected Lorenzo to support her authority. Instead, he had elevated a maid above the most powerful people in attendance. Whispers erupted across the ballroom. Some believed Lorenzo had lost control of his emotions. Others suspected the maid possessed dangerous information. Only Lorenzo knew the truth. While the doctor cleaned Isabella's wounds, he quietly examined the necklace. Inside its worn silver locket rested a faded photograph. It showed Isabella as a child beside an elderly priest. Behind them stood a frightened teenage boy whose face was partly hidden. Lorenzo recognized himself immediately. The priest had secretly taken the picture on the night Isabella had saved him. She had carried that memory for years without realizing who he had become. He closed the locket gently. Outside the room, Vanessa's anger boiled into desperation. She summoned members of her own family. Unlike Lorenzo's disciplined organization, the Romano alliance depended on political marriages and fragile loyalty. If Lorenzo cancelled their engagement, her family's influence would collapse. She decided Isabella had to disappear before the truth spread. That same night, rival Mafia leader Marco Vitali learned chaos had erupted inside Lorenzo's mansion. Marco had waited years for an opportunity to fracture the Romano Empire. Now he bribed 2 corrupt guards with a simple order. Kill the maid. Frame Vanessa. Watch the empire destroy itself from within. As midnight approached, assassins slipped into the medical wing. But Lorenzo never trusted coincidence. Ever since recognizing Isabella, he had secretly doubled security around her room. The gunman never reached the door. Silenced gunfire echoed through the hallway. Within minutes, every assassin lay dead. The surviving guard confessed everything. Vanessa overheard enough to realize someone was manipulating events. For the first time that evening, genuine fear entered her heart. She confronted Lorenzo privately. She insisted she had punished Isabella only because the maid had stumbled and spilled wine on an influential politician. Lorenzo listened without interruption. Then he asked a single question. Did she deserve the whip? Vanessa couldn't answer. Because deep inside she knew the truth. She hadn't struck Isabella over spilled wine. She had struck her out of jealousy. Earlier that evening she had caught Lorenzo watching the servants as they prepared the ballroom. His gaze had paused on Isabella for only a second. Vanessa had interpreted it as attraction. Her pride demanded humiliation. Now that moment threatened everything. Meanwhile, Isabella awoke in the medical suite, confused by the kindness surrounding her. She begged the nurses to let her return to work. She feared losing the only job that kept her younger brother in school. When Lorenzo entered, she lowered her eyes again. He asked why she had never searched for the wounded boy she once rescued. She smiled sadly. Because I hoped he escaped. Nothing more. No request for money. No demand for gratitude. Only relief that a stranger had survived. Her answer struck Lorenzo harder than any bullet. He realized every powerful person around him wanted something. Respect. Fear. Money. Influence. Only Isabella had ever expected nothing. As dawn approached, Marco Vitali launched the second phase of his plan. Explosions rocked 2 Romano warehouses. Rumors spread that Lorenzo had become distracted by a servant while enemies seized his territory. Several captains urged immediate retaliation. Others questioned Lorenzo's judgment. The empire trembled. Vanessa believed she could still save herself. She publicly blamed Isabella for bringing bad luck into the family. Some guests accepted the lie. Others remembered Lorenzo placing his own jacket over the injured maid. Loyalty within the organization split for the first time. Then Lorenzo called every captain, ally, politician, and business partner to the mansion. The grand ballroom filled again. Only this time no music played. No champagne flowed. In the center stood Isabella wearing a simple dress instead of a servant's uniform. Beside her stood Vanessa. The tension became unbearable. Everyone expected Lorenzo to choose between his future wife and an insignificant maid. He slowly addressed the room. He revealed the photograph. He told the story of a nameless girl who had saved a dying teenager without asking his family name or expecting reward. He confessed that the ruthless empire everyone feared existed only because one compassionate girl had refused to abandon a wounded stranger. The silence afterward was overwhelming. Then Lorenzo looked directly at Vanessa. "You whipped the person who gave me my life." Vanessa finally understood. There would be no forgiveness. But before Lorenzo could announce his decision, gunfire exploded through the stained glass windows. Marco Vitali's soldiers stormed the mansion. The ballroom descended into chaos. Guests screamed. Tables overturned. Bodyguards returned fire. In the confusion, one assassin slipped toward Isabella with a hidden pistol. She never saw him coming. Lorenzo did. Without hesitation, he stepped between them. The bullet struck his shoulder. For the first time in years, the invincible Mafia king bled before his entire organization. The sight ignited something primal inside his loyal soldiers. Within minutes, the attackers were overwhelmed. Marco's assault had failed. But Lorenzo's willingness to take a bullet for a maid changed the balance of power forever. Every captain now understood exactly where his loyalty truly belonged. Resolution. Marco Vitali fled the city before sunrise. He believed Lorenzo's injury would delay retaliation. Instead, it accelerated it. Within 48 hours, Lorenzo dismantled Marco's criminal network piece by piece. Smuggling routes vanished. Bank accounts were frozen. Safe houses were exposed. The rival boss was eventually captured by the very men he had once paid, proving that fear built unstable loyalty while respect endured. Back at the Romano estate, Lorenzo made an announcement no one expected. His engagement to Vanessa was officially over. There would be no secret settlement. No quiet arrangement to protect powerful families. He declared that anyone who abused the weak under his protection had no place beside him. Vanessa's family lost influence almost overnight. Business partners withdrew, allies distanced themselves, and the image of untouchable authority crumbled. The humiliation she had inflicted on another became the humiliation she carried herself. Isabella, however, wanted none of the luxury now being offered to her. She asked only that her younger brother's education be funded and that the servants who had remained silent out of fear not be punished. Her compassion surprised even Lorenzo's oldest advisors. Many had expected revenge. Instead, she chose mercy. That decision transformed the atmosphere within the estate. Employees who had once worked in fear found themselves treated with unexpected dignity. Lorenzo introduced strict rules forbidding abuse by anyone, regardless of rank or family name. Respect became a requirement, not a privilege. Some captains quietly questioned whether kindness made their leader weaker. They quickly discovered the opposite. The organization became more loyal than ever. Men who had once obeyed Lorenzo because they feared him now followed because they believed in him. Power rooted in terror had become power strengthened by honor. Weeks later, Lorenzo returned to the abandoned church where his life had changed years earlier. Isabella accompanied him. The building was quiet, its old wooden pews untouched by time. Together they found the weathered bench where a frightened teenage girl had shared her last piece of bread with a wounded stranger. Neither spoke for a long while. Some memories required silence more than words. Lorenzo finally admitted that he had spent years building an empire capable of crushing enemies, yet all his victories had failed to fill the emptiness left by never thanking the person who had saved him. Isabella smiled gently. She told him that saving someone had never been a transaction. It had simply been the right thing to do. Those words lingered with him long after they left the church. Months later, the Romano Empire was no longer known only for ruthless efficiency. Rivals still feared crossing Lorenzo, but ordinary people whispered that his organization had become strangely different. Debts were collected fairly. Families under its protection were left unharmed. Servants and workers were treated with respect. The change began with a single act of compassion remembered after many years. At the next grand gathering inside the mansion, the ballroom looked almost identical to the night that had changed everything. The chandeliers sparkled. The orchestra played softly. Guests filled the room. But one detail was different. No servant lowered their head in fear. When Isabella entered, they greeted her with genuine smiles. Lorenzo walked beside her, not because she needed protection, but because she had become the person he trusted most. Many wondered how a plus-size maid had transformed the heart of the city's coldest mafia boss. Those who knew the full story understood the answer. She never changed him with power. She changed him with humanity. And in a world ruled by violence, that proved to be the strongest force of all. Long after the music ended, guests continued discussing the unforgettable night when a whip cracked across a ballroom, and an empire changed forever. Some said it was the moment a ruthless king found his conscience. Others believed it was the night justice finally entered a house built on fear. Either way, no one who witnessed it ever forgot the image of the mafia boss placing his own jacket over a wounded maid while an entire party stood frozen in silence. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge is not destroying an empire. It is rebuilding it around the one person everyone else underestimated. The silence inside the Romano mansion lasted only a few seconds after Lorenzo carried Isabella from the ballroom. Then the empire began to crack. Within minutes, videos of the engagement party had leaked onto the dark web. Grainy footage showed the future queen of the Romano syndicate whipping a plus-size maid while the most feared mafia boss in Europe covered her with his own jacket instead of defending his fiancée. Every rival family watched. Every politician connected to organized crime watched. Every captain within Lorenzo's organization watched. No one cared about the maid. They cared that Lorenzo Romano had broken one of the oldest mafia rules. A king never showed his heart. Inside the private medical suite, Isabella sat quietly as the family physician cleaned the deep cuts across her back. She refused painkillers despite the burning agony. Years of hardship had taught her to endure suffering without complaint. The elderly doctor looked at Lorenzo with confusion. "I've treated you after gunfights, explosions, and assassination attempts," he murmured. "I've never seen you this concerned." Lorenzo didn't answer. His cold eyes remained fixed on Isabella. She kept apologizing. "I'm sorry I ruined your engagement. I'm sorry your guests had to see this. I'm sorry for causing trouble." Every apology felt like another knife twisting inside Lorenzo's chest. She believed she was the problem, not the woman who had ordered the beating. For the first time in years, Lorenzo questioned the empire he had built. Outside the medical wing, Vanessa Romano had already begun repairing the damage. She gathered influential guests into the private library. "The maid is mentally unstable," she lied smoothly. "She deliberately spilled wine on me, then attacked me when I corrected her." Several politicians nodded. Businessmen whispered. Vanessa knew appearances mattered more than truth. If she could destroy Isabella's reputation before Lorenzo spoke publicly, she could still save the engagement. But someone else was listening. Hidden beyond the half-open doorway stood Matteo Ricci, Lorenzo's oldest underboss. For 20 years Matteo had served Lorenzo without hesitation. He understood something Vanessa did not. Lorenzo never forgave cruelty. Matteo quietly walked away. An hour later, Lorenzo received a recording of Vanessa's lies. He watched the video once, then deleted it. He didn't need evidence anymore. He had already made his decision. Across the city, another pair of eyes followed every development. Marco Vitali, head of the Vitali cartel. Lorenzo's oldest enemy. Where Lorenzo ruled through discipline, Marco ruled through chaos. His empire thrived on trafficking, betrayal, and fear. Watching the leaked footage, Marco smiled. So, the great Lorenzo Romano finally found his weakness. He immediately summoned his lieutenants. If the maid dies tonight, Lorenzo will destroy Vanessa. If Vanessa survives, she'll destroy Lorenzo from inside. Either way, we win. Within minutes, Marco dispatched 6 professional assassins toward the Romano estate. Unaware of the danger approaching, Isabella prepared to leave. She folded Lorenzo's expensive jacket carefully. "I should go." "You've done enough." Lorenzo looked at her as if she had spoken another language. "Done enough." She smiled weakly. "I don't belong here." You have your empire. I have my life. Our worlds are different. Lorenzo stepped closer. They were different once. His eyes drifted toward the silver necklace around her neck. You've worn that necklace for years. Isabella touched it instinctively. It belonged to my parents. Why? Because it reminds me that kindness survives longer than money. The words struck Lorenzo harder than any bullet. Kindness. The one thing missing from his empire. Before he could answer, the mansion lights suddenly went dark. Every chandelier. Every security monitor. Every hallway. Complete darkness. 3 seconds later, gunfire erupted outside. The emergency alarm screamed through the estate. Lorenzo's instincts took over instantly. He pulled Isabella behind him. Stay behind me. The calmness in his voice terrified her more than the gunfire. It meant this wasn't unusual. This was simply another day in Lorenzo Romano's world. Outside, dozens of black SUVs smashed through the front gates. Marco Vitoli's soldiers flooded the estate. Automatic weapons lit the gardens with flashes of orange fire. Romano bodyguards answered immediately. The peaceful mansion transformed into a battlefield. Bullets shattered marble pillars. Luxury cars exploded. Guests trapped inside the ballroom screamed as security rushed them into panic rooms. The engagement party had become a war zone. Lorenzo guided Isabella through hidden corridors beneath the mansion. The underground tunnels had been built decades earlier for exactly this reason. Halfway through the escape route, they found Matteo waiting. His face was pale. Boss. We've got another problem. The attack wasn't random. Matteo handed Lorenzo a tablet. Security footage appeared. Vanessa. Speaking privately with Marco Vitoli's attorney only 3 days earlier. Another video. Encrypted bank transfers. Another. Secret meetings. The betrayal unfolded piece by piece. Vanessa hadn't merely humiliated Isabella. She had been negotiating Lorenzo's downfall for months. The engagement had always been a trap. Matteo lowered his voice. Someone inside the Romano family has been feeding Marco our operations. Lorenzo's expression remained unreadable. Only Isabella noticed his clenched fist. The woman he intended to marry had already sold his empire. Suddenly, an explosion ripped through the underground tunnel. Dust filled the air. Concrete collapsed behind them. Enemy soldiers had discovered the escape route. The chase began. Lorenzo drew his pistol. His movements were terrifyingly efficient. One shot. One enemy down. Another rounded the corner. Another precise shot. No hesitation. No wasted movement. Isabella had never seen someone kill with such frightening calm. She realized the gentle man protecting her was also the monster the underworld feared. The realization shook her. Could someone capable of so much violence truly care about her? Another explosion answered the question. The ceiling cracked. A concrete beam crashed toward Isabella. Before she could react, Lorenzo shoved her away. The beam slammed into his shoulder. Bones cracked. Blood soaked his white shirt beneath the black suit. Still, he stood, ignoring the pain, ignoring the blood, ignoring everything except Isabella. Are you hurt? She stared at him in disbelief. You saved me. Again. He simply nodded. As many times as necessary. Those 5 words shattered the walls Isabella had built around her heart. For years she had believed no one would ever choose her. Not with her curves. Not with her ordinary life. Not with the scars poverty had left behind. Yet the most powerful man in the criminal world had thrown himself beneath falling concrete without thinking twice. Tears blurred her vision. Not from fear, but because someone had finally made her feel worth saving. Before either of them could speak again, Matteo's radio crackled. His voice changed instantly. Boss. The captains are turning on each other. Half the organization believes Vanessa. The other half believes you. The Romano syndicate is splitting. Lorenzo closed his eyes for a single second. Marco's real attack had never been the bullets. It was division. If the captains declared separate loyalties, decades of power would collapse overnight. Civil war was only hours away. Lorenzo looked toward Isabella. then toward the burning mansion above, then at the pistol in his hand. To save the woman he had searched for over 10 years. He might have to destroy everything else he had spent his life building. And somewhere above them, hidden in the smoke-filled mansion, Vanessa smiled. She believed Lorenzo was trapped. She believed she had already won. She had no idea that the greatest storm of his life had only just begun. Smoke still curled above the shattered Romano estate as dawn painted the horizon in cold shades of grey. Half the mansion lay in ruins. Luxury cars burned in the courtyard. The engagement celebration had become the bloodiest night in the history of the Romano syndicate. Yet Lorenzo Romano wasn't focused on the destruction. He was focused on one final betrayal. As emergency crews secured the property, every surviving captain received the same message. Report to the Hall of Kings immediately. No excuses. No delays. No weapons. Within an hour, more than 50 of the most powerful men in the underworld stood inside the syndicate's ancient council chamber. They expected revenge against Marco Vitali. Instead, Lorenzo walked in with Isabella beside him. She was no longer wearing a maid's uniform. She wore a simple cream-colored dress, while the silver necklace that had reunited their destinies rested against her heart. The room erupted in whispers. A maid had never entered the Hall of Kings. Lorenzo raised one hand. Silence returned instantly. Without saying a word, he pressed a remote control. The massive screen behind him came alive. Every hidden recording Matteo had recovered began playing before the entire council. Vanessa secretly meeting Marco Vitali's representatives. Encrypted payments flowing into offshore accounts. Blueprints of Romano's safehouses exchanged for millions of dollars. Plans for Lorenzo's assassination discussed over expensive dinners. The evidence was undeniable. Vanessa hadn't betrayed only Lorenzo. She had betrayed every family that had sworn loyalty to the Romano syndicate. Several captains lowered their heads in shame. Others clenched their fists. One elderly don whispered the words no one wanted to hear. Death is the only punishment. Vanessa was escorted into the chamber moments later. For the first time in years, the woman who once ruled every ballroom looked terrified. She fell to her knees before Lorenzo. She begged. She blamed Marco. She blamed fear. She blamed jealousy. She blamed Isabella. But she never accepted responsibility. Lorenzo listened without interrupting. When she finally fell silent, he spoke only once. You whipped an innocent woman because you believed kindness was weakness. He paused. Today you'll learn that mercy requires far more strength than cruelty. The captains looked at one another in confusion. Lorenzo wasn't reaching for his gun. Instead, he stripped Vanessa of every title, every asset, every share of the Romano fortune, and every protection attached to the family name. She was exiled permanently, forbidden from ever using the Romano name again. In the underworld, where reputation was more valuable than gold, the punishment was worse than death. She walked out of the hall with nothing. The same emptiness she had once forced others to feel. Justice had arrived without another drop of blood. But Lorenzo's war wasn't over. A coded message interrupted the meeting. Marco Vitali had been located at an abandoned shipyard on the city's waterfront. He wasn't running. He was waiting. Lorenzo smiled for the first time in months. It was enough to make every captain stand. Within minutes, a convoy of armored vehicles raced toward the harbor. Rain poured across rusted shipping containers as Marco's soldiers prepared for one final battle. The firefight erupted with explosive force. Bullets sparked against steel. Engines exploded. The air filled with smoke and thunder. Marco believed Lorenzo would arrive angry. Instead, Lorenzo arrived focused. Every move was calculated. Every command precise. His soldiers advanced like a single machine, dismantling Marco's defenses one position at a time. Within 20 minutes, the battlefield fell silent. Marco stood alone, wounded and surrounded. He laughed bitterly. All this for a maid. Lorenzo stepped closer. No, for the woman who reminded me who I was before I became a monster. Those words carried more weight than any victory. Marco lowered his weapon. His empire was finished. By sunset, every remaining Vitali operation had surrendered to the Romano syndicate. The war that had consumed the underworld for more than a decade ended in a single day. Weeks passed. The Romano estate was rebuilt, not as a symbol of fear, but as a symbol of order. The servants' quarters were renovated before Lorenzo repaired his own private wing. Employees received contracts, fair wages, and protection. Anyone abusing those beneath them was immediately dismissed, regardless of rank. The captains noticed the difference. Respect produced loyalty more powerful than intimidation ever had. As for Isabella, she refused every title Lorenzo tried to give her. She declined luxury cars. She declined private security. She even declined a mansion of her own. Instead, she asked Lorenzo to build something else. A charitable foundation for children who had lost their parents to organized crime. Lorenzo agreed without hesitation. The project became the first legitimate organization ever funded entirely by the Romano fortune. Months later, the restored ballroom welcomed guests once again. The chandeliers sparkled just as they had on the night everything changed. But this celebration was different. No one stood in fear. No servant lowered their eyes. No whip hung on the wall. When Isabella entered the room, every employee applauded. Not because she had become wealthy, but because she had reminded an empire that dignity belonged to everyone. Lorenzo crossed the ballroom and stopped before her. Without a single word, he removed the silver necklace from around her neck. The room fell silent. Then he replaced its worn chain with one handcrafted in white gold, preserving the same cherished pendant that had guided them back to each other. It wasn't the value of the chain that mattered. It was his promise that her past would never be forgotten as they built their future. Isabella smiled through quiet tears. Years earlier, she had saved a frightened stranger with nothing but compassion. She never imagined that kindness would return to her in the form of unwavering love. The guests watched the once feared Mafia king gently take her hand. No speeches were needed. No grand declarations. His actions had already said everything. The empire still feared Lorenzo Romano. But now they respected him even more. Because the strongest man in the underworld had proven the greatest power was never found in violence. It was found in choosing compassion when revenge seemed easier. Now tell me, if you had Lorenzo's power, would you have chosen mercy for Vanessa? Or would you have demanded revenge?